A lot of things are happening in Ukraine, so much that it can be hard to keep the big picture. So in this video, I want to give an overview of how the war is going. And there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. There's been a lot going on in Ukraine, and in the media, there is often a focus on sort of the most spectacular events. And that can make it hard to get the big picture of the bigger trends. So sometimes I think it's useful to take some time to get an overview. And in this video, I am using maps from the Institute for the Study of War. Let's start on the border to Belarus. There is a lot of talk about whether now may be the time for Belarus to enter the war. It seems that Russia is generally looking for ways to escalate, and Lukashenko has said some things that make it sound as if Belarus is ready to fight on Russia's side. But we will see. I still don't think it would be a smart thing to do because the Belarusian army is not particularly strong compared to the Ukrainian one. But I guess it is possible that Putin could perhaps pressure Lukashenko into doing it anyways. I think if Belarus does engage, then it will probably not change the outcome of the war, but it could be a distraction for Ukraine for a while. But another point is it could also escalate the conflict in the sense that it could perhaps lead to unrest in Belarus, and who knows how Russia would react to that. So it could lead to more instability in the region in general. But overall, I will say that I don't think it's likely that Belarus will do this. We have seen, though, that Belarus is letting Russia use their territory to launch drone strikes against Ukraine. So that is happening. Then if we move on to the Sumy region, there is actually quite a bit of activity, and it's largely on the Russian side of the border. This is something that I think doesn't always get a lot of attention in the Western media, but it seems that Ukraine is actually conducting some pretty big attacks into Russia. They are probably attacking Russia's logistical systems, but it's clearly something that the Russians are annoyed about, and it gets quite a bit of coverage in the Russian media. Then we get to the main fronts. Ukraine is having success on two fronts right now. In the east, they have practically pushed Russia out of the Kharkiv region, and they are pushing into Luhansk. Right now, the big fight is over a city called Svatove, but Ukraine is pushing eastward, and it looks like it is just a matter of time before they will have taken back a significant portion of the Luhansk region. And that is significant because it is the only one of the four regions that Russia just annexed that they actually fully control. So that's probably just a matter of time. A good guess is that Ukraine is going to see if they can get so deep into Luhansk that they can cut off the rail lines that Russia uses to bring supplies to Luhansk and Donetsk. It's also possible that if Ukraine takes Svatove, then they will afterwards continue with the city of Kreminna. And if they do that, then the next step can be a new battle over the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. The big questions on this front line is how much Ukraine can do before the winter arrives, because things will get more difficult as time goes by. And also how much Russia can reinforce their defenses here with their mobilized soldiers. We have already seen some of the mobilized forces on this front line, so they are arriving quickly. So this means that the Ukrainian offensive here may be somewhat time limited, because both of these things will mean that it will get harder for Ukraine over time. But for now, Ukraine is still pushing ahead and taking more ground. Somewhat paradoxically, a little south of this area, Russia is on the offensive. They are still trying to take the city of Bakhmut. They have been attacking Bakhmut now for about 3 months. It's a little hard to see the bigger plan behind this when they are having so big problems just a little north of this. But it's the Wagner Group here, the private military company, that is attacking Bakhmut. I guess that to some extent it's more of a psychological thing to keep them motivated. Now let's move on to the Kherson area. Here Ukraine is also on the offensive. It's happening in the area west of Dnipro, but the area can also be subdivided into the areas east and west of the Inhulets River. Ukraine has made some very big gains in the area east of Inhulets, and this is the area where Russia looks weakest. It's likely that Ukraine will take more ground here over the coming weeks, and this gives Russia a dilemma, because that will mean that they will either have to pull back across the Dnipro River or across the Inhulets River. There's a crossing across Dnipro in connection with the Novokakhovka Dam, but if Ukraine can get all the way to Novokakhovka, then that possibility will close and the Russians can only pull back across the Inhulets. And in fact, the Ukrainians don't even have to get that far. Once they get close enough that Novokakhovka is within artillery range, then the passage might be unusable for the Russians. And that will give the Russians big problems, because that is the way they bring supplies to the troops in this area. So, long story short, I think things are beginning to look pretty bad for the Russians in this area east of Inhulets. And if the Ukrainians can push just a little further, then it will go from bad to impossible. So we could see the Russians having to give up the whole area and pull back across the Inhulets. And the thing is that if that happens, then the situation will in fact get even worse, because this will mean that a very large group of Russian forces will be surrounded by Ukrainian forces in an area that is so small that everything is within range of the Ukrainian artillery. And this would include the bridges and the ferries that Russia uses to supply these forces. So these forces would be pretty much at the mercy of the Ukrainians. And to get things into perspective, the numbers that I've seen are that we have about 15,000 Russian soldiers in this area and about 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers. So if we suddenly have 15,000 Russian soldiers squeezed together west of the Inhulets with Ukrainian artillery covering every inch, then it can get really ugly. And the challenge is, of course, that Kherson city is in this area. From a military point of view, the only smart thing to do for the Russians would be to get out as quickly as possible, to pull back across the Dnipro and use the soldiers for something else that is more sustainable. But they're not going to do that, because that is politically unacceptable. Kherson would be the biggest city for Russia to lose so far in the war, and it is the regional capital of a region that Russia has just annexed. So that's not going to happen, and therefore we might very well see this scenario play out where a large group of Russian forces is going to get trapped west of the Inhulets. Then, of course, I also have to mention the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was attacked. This is a very significant event because the bridge is important for the Russian military logistics, and also symbolically, of course, but I'm going to focus on the military value here. This bridge is very important for Russia's ability to sustain the fighting on the southern front in Ukraine. This includes the forces in the Kherson region and the Zaporizhzhia region. Even if the bridge is still working but has a reduced capacity, then that can have big consequences for Russia's ability to conduct the war. And now that the bridge has been hit once, then the question is, of course, whether it can happen again. And this gives Russia some more dilemmas in Ukraine, because if the bridge is destroyed, then the only realistic way of supplying the forces is through the land corridor from Donetsk. And this is extremely vulnerable. To begin with, the capacity on the railroad here is much smaller, but also it is within HIMARS range from the front line, and even more significant, there is a risk that Ukraine could make a new counteroffensive here and cut the connection. If Ukraine could do that, like both destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge and cut off the land corridor, then the Russian forces in Kherson Oblast and Crimea would be in deep trouble. So Russia now has to allocate more forces to preventing this from happening. A big question is, of course, whether Ukraine has the strength to do this. Like, they already have a big offensive on Luhansk and another one in Kherson. So do they have the forces to also have a third one in Zaporizhzhia? Like, I don't know the answer to this question, of course, but I will suggest that gradually Ukraine is in a position where they can free up soldiers around Kherson. And the same is not true for Russia. Because the front line is getting shorter, and if Ukraine can manage to push the Russian forces together on that small area west of the Inhulets, then they could begin to move some of the forces on to other areas, without actually losing the control. I think it might actually not be in Ukraine's interest to finish the offensive in Kherson at this moment, because it is tying up a lot of Russian forces and consuming many of their resources. Like Ukraine might as well keep it that way until they have made an offensive in Zaporizhzhia. And these are the kinds of dilemmas that Putin has to make decisions about these days. Like, should they prioritize the Luhansk front line, the Kherson front line, or the Zaporizhzhia front line? Can they rely on the Kerch Strait Bridge? Do they have a backup plan if the bridge is destroyed? Is this sustainable in the long run when Ukraine is receiving supplies from the West? Like, these are tough dilemmas. I think it was Ben Hodges who expressed it this way, that Russia wants to be the second strongest army in the world, but at the moment they're only the second strongest army in Ukraine. Like, when we look at the military map, it does indeed look like Ukraine has the strongest army right now. And this is what we have to keep in mind when Russia makes those attacks on Ukrainian cities with cruise missiles. Like, they can't keep doing this for long because they don't have like endless reserves of these missiles. And on the front line, it is still Ukraine that has the momentum and the strategic initiative. If we look back a few months, there was almost a standstill on the front lines, and some people started asking whether the war had turned into a frozen conflict. Like, back then, I made a video where I tried to explain the difference between a frozen conflict and a war of attrition. And I made this graph to illustrate how a war of attrition works, where I said that if one side is losing fighting power faster than the other side, then the standstill is only a temporary thing. Because then at some point, one of them is going to get the upper hand and things will start moving again. And I think, simply put, this is what's happening. Like, Ukraine has won the phase of attrition and now they have the upper hand. Okay, I'm going to end it here. If you found the video useful, please give it a like. It's a great help because it tells the YouTube algorithm to suggest the video to more people. And also, you can subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.